Hi, this is Garvey Campbell and you are watching Carnival 24. And in our last interview, we spoke with Richard Seale, the owner and master distiller of Foursquare rum in Barbados. Within that video, we discussed how rum is produced, why Caribbean rum needs to be protected, and geographical indication. The export of rum is one of the exports that the Caribbean is known for, a region which many also say is the most tourism-dependent region in the world. But we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the Caribbean in the area of trade, as it enables countries to obtain the things it doesn't have and to export the things that it does have in order to improve the economy, maintain living standards, and create new opportunities. And as a result, it's extremely important for development and regional integration in many countries in the global south. In addition to this, Brexit, the new African Free Trade Area, and tariff wars between America and China have made trade an increasingly hot topic that governments are paying more attention to. So in order to discuss this, we invited 𝗘𝐈𝐶 Nichols, a trade and development consultant based in Barbados and with a great deal of knowledge on regional and international trade in the Caribbean. And in this interview, we asked her to give us a good understanding of regional and international trade, what the Caribbean is currently doing to improve trade and exports, and what we can do to help the Caribbean in this area. So keep watching, remember to like, share and subscribe, and we hope you enjoy the second part of our interview with 𝗘𝐈𝐶 Nichols. Awesome. So on the back of that moves me on to the next thing. So you mentioned that negotiations have come to gridlock quite a few times. They haven't been able to progress. And obviously what we've seen is that the Western world, or the global North and the global South, a lot of the time there seems to be a lot of friction between what they want and what they can agree to when it comes to these trade agreements. And as you've mentioned, I mean, that's fascinating that you're saying only one of them really has been able to go the distance and go through. Would you be able to tell us like what some of these main bones of contention are, what these main disagreements are? Because I think it would be good for our audience to know, why is it that a lot of this is like a world organization? Why is it getting into these situations where they're not meeting resolutions and trade agreements the way it's supposed to?
Mm-hmm. Right. So I mean, I think first let me say that I'm a supporter of the WTO. I think that the WTO gets a really bad rap in many cases, and I'm not saying it's perfect, but I think, as you know, the phrase is often said, if we didn't have a WTO, we would have to create one, because if not, it would be the law of the jungle. At the same time, I think there are several issues that have led to the dysfunction, so to speak, particularly, the fact that there hasn't been a way to really come to terms with some of the issues that are being negotiated. And one of them is the fact that there's some disagreement on who really should be considered a developing country in the WTO. Right now at the WTO, to be considered a developing country, you just designate yourself as a developing country. But what a lot of the global North is saying is that, why should countries, say like China or India or Brazil or what have you, have the same levels of flexibilities in the WTO that, say, a Barbados or a Mauritius would have, right? So that's one of the bones of contention, because, and I probably should double back a bit here because your viewers would not necessarily know the importance of this. If you're designated as a developing country, or you self-declare rather as a developing country, there's certain flexibilities in the WTO's agreements called special differential treatment, which you would be entitled to. So things like longer time frames in which to implement agreements, access to technical assistance, those sorts of things for implementing the agreements, those sorts of things. And what a lot of developed countries are saying is that countries such as China, India, whatnot, which really and truly are very competitive and even more competitive than some developed countries, really should not be entitled to these same level of flexibilities as, say, like a Barbados or St. Lucia or what have you. Another thing is the fact that a lot of developing countries do not think that developed countries have done enough to take their concerns into account. So, for example, the whole issue of agricultural subsidies. there's the concern that, look, developed countries still have a lot of subsidies for their farmers, which of course makes it difficult for developing countries, which don't have the wherewithal to subsidize their farmers the way that developed countries do in order to compete in the global economy. There's that. There's also the issue that a lot of developing countries say, all right, you talk about eligibility for special and differential treatment, but what about the effectiveness of the special and differential treatment? What about the fact that we feel as though, yes, we have these special flexibilities in black letter law, so to speak, in terms of the text of the agreements, but we don't feel as though it has made us develop or made trade for us any more fair or anything like that. So there are lots of issues that are still to be resolved. The fact that the Doha round, which was the round that was started in 2001, which was supposed to be a development round, things like fishery subsidies, have still not been concluded. Some areas where developing countries feel as though they have a greater interest are not concluded, but then you have some developed countries saying, look, we want to bring in new areas that weren't initially agreed to. So that's one of the things too, like, should you try to finish the Doha mandate before you move on to new areas, or should you move on to these new areas because the global trade has changed since the WTO came into existence in 1995? So I know, again, that's a mouthful, but it's a lot of issues to tease out, and there's a lot that they're grappling with.
Yeah, the fact that you brought up the subsidies as well is also, again, a fascinating area in and of itself. So what we see on our side is we see governments who are subsidizing their own, the things that they export in order to make sure that their businesses perhaps are protected, and making sure that their country and their businesses are bringing in X amount of money. So they're engaging in something that's called protectionism, which we looked up. We've been looking into what that is, and then you've also got the issue of tariff wars, where people are using trade as a leverage against governments, and to try to have influence in countries that maybe they don't favor or they have disagreements with. Would you be able to give like a really brief overview on some of these aspects that are affecting trade that have nothing really to do with greasing the wheels and allowing trade and exports to really move freely, but they're used instead to kind of as levers, as ways to negotiate change in countries that are not your own, and how it affects maybe the Caribbean also, if indeed it does?
Okay, sure. Right. So yes, there have been tariff wars happening, mainly the US under that president, who shall remain nameless. But that, I look at that situation as an anomaly, so to speak, because the US's position, even though they have their issues with the WTO, has never been one where they were against the WTO. I mean, the US actually was one of the founders, one of the countries pushing for the foundation of the WTO. So to have a president coming in and, basically, not supporting the WTO's mandate and, wanting to engage in trade wars and whatnot, that is a bit of an anomaly. I mean, yes, there have been other trade wars happening. So for instance, you have Australia and China, for instance, the dispute there, what have you. But I think that at the end of the day, I think it would have been worse if the WTO weren't around. I still think that the WTO, and there's only a few countries which engage in this tit for tat behavior. Protectionism, is a bad word. We tend to see it as a bad word, but I mean, all countries engage in some form of protectionism, whether it is a country wanting to protect its infant industry or what have you. So I don't necessarily see protectionism as a bad thing once it doesn't impact negatively on global trade. But I think that in many ways that if it weren't for the WTO, a lot of the bad behavior that you alluded to would have been a lot worse, because at least the WTO acts as a restraining force and as a mechanism where if countries feel that they have been, they feel as though the behavior of another country has been, contrary to its rights under the WTO, its obligations under the WTO, they could challenge that, and they have challenged. So China has challenged the US, Australia, I think they brought a case against China, so I think that there will always be bad behavior, but at least the WTO helps to mitigate it somewhat.
Okay, so I'm going to move into talking about trade and specifically more about the Caribbean. But before I do, before we move on to that, would you be able to maybe give your own opinion on what some of the things, what things could be done or put in place, or what changes might be made in order to improve the WTO and maybe minimize some of these issues that are coming up between countries with regards to some of these trade agreements?
I mean, there's no one-cut answer, to be honest. And I mean, there has been a lot written on ways in which the WTO could be improved. Certainly, one of those ways is to make it easier for small countries which might have disputes in order to, because, so far only one Caribbean country has brought a dispute against another WTO member, that's Antigua. And Antigua won that case. The problem with that case is that the US and Antigua have not been able to come to a meeting of minds, so to speak, with regard to the resolution of that dispute. But Antigua did win it in the WTO. So that's, a good example of David being able to take on Goliath because of the WTO being in existence. But one of the things that I would recommend, others have recommended, is to find ways to make it easier for small countries in order to do what Antigua did. It is very difficult for countries to bring disputes because obviously they have to hire foreign counsel, which is not always, the most cost effective, but they have no choice because they don't have the local expertise. Another thing would be ways in which you could find another way of resolving making decisions in the WTO. The consensus model that currently exists at the WTO has been useful because it gives all of us a voice. But then at the same time, it has been used against it, which you really saw under the US, under Trump, where, for instance, they were able to use their vote to block the appointment of the now Director General, Dr. 𝗵𝗫𝐺𝐈 𝗵𝗫𝐺. So I think maybe there needs to be a lot more consideration of some of the recommendations that would have been made about ways in which the negotiations process could be made a lot more effective, and certainly the dispute settlement process could be made a lot more effective, particularly for small countries.
Right. Okay. So moving on to the Caribbean, what would you say is some of the challenges facing countries in the Caribbean in the area of trade? Barbados is now going through the process of, separating itself and doing its own thing. Congratulations, by the way. I've been following that here quite avidly. But what would you say are some of the challenges facing developing countries in the Caribbean in the area of trade?
Okay, sure. But just for clarity, thank you very much for the Republic greetings. But just to say that our Turner Republic will have no impact on our trade. We have always been an independent state, and our becoming a republic has nothing to do with trade for us. I do think that in terms of some of the issues that we are facing, I think a lot of it is the fact that we are very undiversified in terms of our economies. Most of us, as I would have said earlier, have tourism as our main sector. And of course, given what's happened with COVID, you have a situation where the main engine of your economy has been affected, of course, with spillover effects for the rest of the economy in terms of job losses and those sorts of things, and losses to economic activity. So that's one of the problems, the undiversified economies. Another thing is the fact that we have a very, in a way, very undiversified trade partners. So for most of us, among our top trading partners are still the US, the UK, the EU, Canada. Certainly in terms of where we import and also our export. Now, where that becomes a problem is when you have supply chain crises like you're having now. So if you're used to only sourcing from these main markets, then naturally it's going to be difficult to do so when you're having these supply chain crises. And it would be easier, I think, in many ways, if we source a lot more from within the region. Another thing, and that brings me to my third challenge, is the fact that our interregional trade is very low, especially when compared to other regions in the world. So I think the last figure I saw was that intra-CARICOM trade was only about 40% of our total trade, whereas in the EU, for instance, it's like 60-something%. With ASEAN is a little lower, but still significantly higher than the 14%. And one of the reasons for that would be logistical, but also the fact that it is so difficult and so expensive to travel throughout the region, to send stuff throughout the region, that sort of thing. So those are like the four main things I would say would be our main trading issues at the moment.
On that final one, I actually don't know this. Is it easy? I don't know. Is it easier for countries within the Caribbean to trade with countries outside of the Caribbean? Is it easier doing that than trading within the region?
In some cases it is. I always tell people, whenever I do something like this, I always tell people, look, it's easier for me to travel to Miami than it is to another Caribbean country. You know, it's quicker for me to send a document to Miami or to the UK than it is to send to other parts of the region. You know, if I want to get to Belize, I have to go through Miami to get there. You know, that's the more cost-effective option for me. So, you know, if you multiply that several times, you realize that intra-regional trade tends to be a lot more difficult than trade with established rules. And there are reasons for this. I mean, you know, people always roll their eyes when we talk about colonialism, but a lot of what happened back then remains with us in terms of our patterns of trade, the fact that most of our trade is with the global north, the fact that most of the things that we trade are still, you know, outside of tourism, it will still be like commodities like sugar or what have you, whereas we get more refined stuff from the global north. So a lot of those are things that still replicate themselves today. Okay,
so I have two questions in one for you then. What would you say are some of the things that can be done to improve things in the Caribbean? And what are some of the things that are happening right now that maybe we who are in the United States and in the UK, we don't hear about? What are some of the things going on in the Caribbean right now to improve trade?
Okay, sure. Well, I mean, I'm happy for that question because I don't want your audience to come away with the impression that we're just sitting down doing nothing. I mean, if I could speak about Barbados as an example, you know, we just recently announced that we're going to establish a slavery museum. And why is that significant? That's significant because a lot of your readers might not know, but Barbados has the largest slave records outside of the UK. And yeah, I didn't know that until I heard the announcement, right? Now, why is that significant? That opens up so many economic possibilities. I mean, I'm thinking not just possibilities for persons like us who might want to know more about our heritage, you know, but also persons who are interested in doing genealogy tourism, which is becoming a big thing, which is a big thing in some parts of the world, you know, tracing your ancestry, you know, persons who want to come here and do research on the slave trade and that sort of thing. That, you know, that creates so many possibilities. So there's that. There's the fact that Our countries have been reaching out to non-traditional partners. So you've seen whether it's China, whether it is the Middle East, whether it is the Asia Pacific region more broadly, you're seeing a lot of our countries, Africa. I mean, how could I forget Africa, So a lot of our countries now are not only establishing diplomatic missions within these countries and more overt political ties, but also you're seeing the private sectors of our countries establishing more links. Because remember, as I keep saying, it's the private sector which trades, right? The government's role is to be a regulator, to be an enabler, a facilitator. But if the private sector doesn't trade, then, no trade is going to happen. So there's that. Then there's also the fact that in our educational system, you're seeing a lot more countries pushing newer industries, newer skills in order to promote newer industries. So STEM, for instance, because a lot of us are looking towards more high value added services as an export. Barbados is looking at establishing a free trade zone, but focusing on high value added exports, services exports. So there's a lot of interesting things happening in the region. And I'm really looking forward to when we get to talk about the diaspora, so we can see, some of the ways in which the diaspora consists.
We hope you enjoyed the second part of our interview with 𝗘𝐶ia Nichols. And if you want to see the rest of the interview, where we talk more about international trade and exports in the Caribbean and why it's so important, then leave a like and a comment telling us hell yeah and more please. And what we'll do is we'll continue to post these videos in 20-minute chunks so that we can get it out there as much as possible. And don't forget, remember to share this video with people who really would be interested and let them know, because we believe people should understand trade and exports and how it affects the Caribbean. This is 𝗵𝐍𝐶𝐂𝐑𝐕𝐈𝐄𝐈, and you have been watching another Carnival 24 interview.